Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. If there's one thing you can count on in Nero Wolfe's brownstone, aside from the strictly enforced 9 a.m. breakfast, it's the silence of the orchid room between 9 and 11. Not silence in the metaphysical sense, actual, judicial, don't dare make a sound silence. It was the kind of hush that even Manhattan sirens couldn't crack. So when I crossed the threshold that morning carrying the mail, I did it with all the subtlety of a cat burglar on carpet. Wolfe stood, as he always did at that hour, looming behind his bench in the orchid room, a pair of delicate tweezers in one hand and an expression of ecclesiastical reverence on his face. You would think he was baptizing the roots of civilization instead of misting the dorsal sepals of a rare, hybrid phalaenopsis. He didn't look up. I didn't expect him to. I placed the letters on the side table, far from his reach and mine, and was about to slide back out like a polite ghost when I paused. There was something off. I'd been working in that house long enough to know when things were crooked, even if the tilt was microscopic. It wasn't the air, it wasn't the orchids. It was Fritz. Fritz Brenner, Wolfe's private chef, was not just punctual, he was the metronome of the household. But this morning I hadn't heard the usual shuffle from the kitchen, no polished copper banging, no faint aromas floating in advance of breakfast. And, most importantly, no Fritz at the door with Wolfe's tray precisely at 8:59 a.m., like a man timed by Swiss engineers. I lingered, listening. Wolfe's head turned a fraction of an inch, which, for him, is the equivalent of a shout. If you intend to loiter, Mr. Goodwin, do it in silence, or go away. I gave him my most respectful nod and exited, but the itch between my shoulder blades didn't go away. Something was wrong, and I'd bet my socks it was in the kitchen. It took another 15 minutes before Fritz appeared, and when he did, the sight of him nearly made me drop my coffee. He looked pale, not the kind of pale you get from flour dust or undercooked lighting, but the kind that clings to the skin when your innards have been twisted by bad news. His hands, usually a ballet of elegance and efficiency, were clasped in front of him like a schoolboy facing the principal. I've seen Fritz in every kind of kitchen chaos, flames, forgotten guests, collapsed soufflés. But I'd never seen him rattled, until now. Wolfe had returned to the office by the time Fritz summoned the courage to enter. I followed him, keeping close, since Fritz in distress wasn't something I wanted Wolfe handling unsupervised. You don't send a panther to console a kitten. Wolfe was at his desk, frowning at a buttered crumpet as if it had betrayed him. "Fritz," he said without looking up, "your coffee has lost body, and the toast is attempting suicide. Explain." Fritz didn't answer immediately. He stood, mouth parted, eyes unfocused, as if his internal grammar had come unbound. "I received a telephone call," he said finally, his voice uncharacteristically dry. "Just now, from L'Art Culinaire." Wolfe shifted, only a little, but for him it was practically a pirouette. "L'Art Culinaire?" Wolfe echoed. "I presume you refer to the exclusive gastronomic society rather than a subscription?" Fritz gave a small nod. "Yes, Auguste Briand is the executive chef there." "Is," Wolfe said. "So he lives?" Fritz's lips tightened. "Barely. He collapsed last night during the final course of a private banquet. They believe—" He stopped, steadied himself. "They believe he was poisoned." That word settled in the room like smoke. Poisoned. It doesn't scream or stab. It whispers. Wolfe frowned. "Then the matter belongs to the police." "Yes," Fritz said, but he looked at me. And then, more softly, "But it may also belong to us." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. He studied Fritz the way he studies a new orchid hybrid, looking for irregularities. Fritz stepped forward, his hand still clenched, and continued. "Auguste and I have been friends for nearly 20 years. When he was a young pastry chef, still learning the art, I gave him a recipe. It was a token of trust, a gesture between friends." His throat tightened. "A parfait?" "A parfait?" Wolfe repeated in a tone that would make it sound like a felony. "Yes," Fritz said. "Layered cream, raspberry coulis, shaved dark chocolate, and—" He faltered. "And Ethiopian vanilla." Wolfe looked up. "Vanilla you acquired through illegal channels 3 years ago." "I never said illegal," Fritz muttered. "Just unconventional." Wolfe waved his hand, dismissing legalities. "Go on." "The parfait was the final course served last night," Fritz said. "At the banquet, Auguste had told me he'd adapted the recipe, refined it, but it was based on mine. He even credited me in the private menu for the guests. And he was poisoned by it." "So it appears." "Bah!" Wolfe grunted. "Coincidence, culinary melodrama. The kitchens of this city are crammed with jealousy and incompetence." Fritz looked stricken. "I don't believe it was a coincidence." Wolfe closed his eyes. "Fritz, your gifts are considerable. Your service to me is estimable, but I cannot chase ghosts for the sake of flavor." Fritz's shoulders drooped. "And I'll admit, seeing that man who once carved a whole turbot with the steadiness of a surgeon look that defeated made something stir in me." "There's more," Fritz said quietly. "The maitre d' told me. The parfait was prepared by Auguste himself. No assistants, no substitutes." Wolfe didn't reply, but I knew that look. The pieces had begun moving inside his head. He didn't respond right away. For Wolfe, reluctance often masquerades as digestion, mental or otherwise. He pushed the plate aside and steepled his fingers. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that Auguste Brillant, a man you trust, used your private recipe to prepare a dessert which appears to have resulted in his poisoning. And this occurred in the presence of elite culinary guests, none of whom suffered ill effects." "Correct." "And that the ingredients were procured by him personally?" "Yes." "And that your reputation, should this recipe be blamed, may be compromised?" Fritz hesitated. "Yes." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Then I suppose I am compelled to consider the matter." He said it like one might say, "I suppose I must attend a funeral." I raised an eyebrow. "You're taking the case?" Wolfe grunted. "I'm not taking a case, Mr. Goodwin. I am attending to an affront, to Fritz, to cuisine, and indirectly to me. I dislike affronts." I had to smile. It wasn't often that culinary insult ranked alongside murder in Wolfe's ledger of personal offences, but when it did, heaven helped the offender. "I'll need to make inquiries," I said. Discreetly, Wolfe added. "Always," I said. "Shall I assume an alias?" "That," Wolfe said, "would presume you possess subtlety. Use your own name, but not your own arrogance. I want facts, not fireworks." Fritz looked like someone had opened a window in a stifling room. Wolfe grumbled under his breath, but I could see it already. He was hooked. And the line, if you asked me, was laced with Ethiopian vanilla. I was in the front room, flipping through Gourmet Monthly, don't ask why, when the doorbell rang with a kind of crisp insistence that suggested a visitor who wasn't just selling subscriptions or collecting for a cause. I opened the door to find a woman standing as if she'd been posed there by an etiquette instructor, back straight, chin up, gloved hands delicately clasped around the handle of a handbag that looked too expensive for its own good. She was polished, French polished to be exact, with the kind of elegance that doesn't come off the rack or out of a bottle. Her dark hair was drawn back in a twist, and her eyes held that curious European mixture of composure and alertness, like a cat that's noticed the can opener. She introduced herself with a soft French accent. "Céleste Doucet," she said. "I work at La Culinaire. I must speak to Mr. Wolfe." I didn't tell her that dropping the name of the most exclusive gastronomic sanctuary in Manhattan was enough to get past our front door without a warrant. I simply stepped aside and gestured her in. "I'll ask if he's accepting interruptions," I said. "He often isn't." She gave the smallest possible nod, as though that was a risk she'd already calculated. I led her to the office and announced her presence with the flourish Wolfe hates. "She's French, well-dressed, and comes bearing the weight of scandal from La Culinaire." That gets her 3 minutes at least. Wolfe looked up from his chair, one eyebrow raised like a lazy semaphore. "I'm not in the habit of entertaining drama," he said. "Then you'll be pleased," Céleste replied smoothly. "This is not drama, it is murder, politely denied." That earned her a seat. Wolfe gestured her in. So did curiosity. She sat like someone trained to sit for long dinners, back straight, ankles crossed, the hem of her skirt unwrinkled. Fritz hovered near the threshold behind me, though he was pretending to reorganize the tray on the sideboard. His face had lost a little of its pallor, but his eyes never left her. "I will speak plainly," Céleste began, glancing from Wolfe to Fritz, and then to me. "Monsieur Briand remains unconscious. The hospital has confirmed that he ingested a toxin, amygdalin they suspect, found in certain bitter almonds and apricot kernels. There was no accident. The police have been notified, but the matter has been contained for now." Wolfe snorted. "Ah, contained. A public poisoning at a private banquet and a collapsed chef. That must have been a neat trick." Céleste lifted her chin. "Only the kitchen and the maitre d' know. No guests have been informed. The owners fear scandal. Our reputation is everything." "Of course," Wolfe said dryly. "Better to risk additional deaths than endure a harsh restaurant review." Céleste ignored the sarcasm. "There is more," she said. "Auguste himself prepared the final dish, the parfait. It was his specialty, based on a recipe he received some years ago." Fritz inhaled sharply, but Céleste kept her gaze steady. "He mentioned it often, a gift from a friend, something refined, elegant." "Is this why you came?" Wolfe asked. "To inform us that our chef's generosity has borne poisoned fruit?" Céleste's voice dropped slightly. "No, monsieur. I came because I believe it was deliberate, and because I saw something that night, something I do not understand, but cannot ignore." That got Wolfe's attention. He adjusted himself in his chair and flicked his fingers toward her. "Go on," he said. "But I warn you, I have no appetite for theatrics." Céleste folded her hands in her lap, perfectly composed, but there was a subtle tension gathering in her voice like a taut violin string. "I was walking past the dessert station," she said. "The lights were dimmed for the final presentation. There was a curtain drawn, as the guests were to receive the dish with a bit of theatrical flourish. But from behind the curtain, I saw movement." "Define movement," Wolfe said. "A shadow," she replied. Someone leaned over the prep table. It was not Auguste. He had already stepped out to address the guests. The silhouette was tall, male. I heard a metallic sound. A bottle, perhaps. When I entered the kitchen fully, the space was empty. Wolfe's eyes were closed now, not from boredom, but from focus. That's when his mind did its finest embroidery. Céleste continued. "I told no one. I was not sure what I had seen. And there are many who resent Auguste's position. He was promoted quickly, and not all the staff approved of his refinements, as they call them." "Names," Wolfe said. "I'll have them." Céleste hesitated. "The sous chef, Marla Keene, She is competent but ambitious. The supplier, Victor Chadney, has had several disputes with Auguste over exclusive ingredient contracts, and Leandro Voss, our pastry chef, though brilliant, is unstable. I made a note. My shorthand for unstable in kitchen circles usually translated to creative with knives. And you? Wolfe asked. Why do you bring this to us and not to your management? I fear, she said softly, that management already knows more than they have said, and that they do not wish to see justice served if it costs them prestige. Her eyes darted to Fritz. And because Monsieur Brenner deserves to know if his recipe was turned into a weapon. Wolfe opened his eyes. Perhaps, he said, we all do. Wolfe had heard enough for curiosity to rouse, but not enough for commitment, which meant the next part would be pure sport. He leaned back slightly and fixed Celeste with that look of his, the one that makes people feel like they've brought counterfeit silver to a collector. You were not on duty as a chef, nor were you personally harmed, yet you chose to visit me directly. Why? Celeste met his gaze without blinking, I'll give her that. She wasn't easily shaken. As assistant maitre d', I am responsible for the harmony of the dining room. I've seen how small frictions in the kitchen can bleed into service. There were tensions surrounding Auguste. And I believe something more sinister has taken root. Wolfe's eyelids drooped. How noble? But I'm asking about your motivation, Miss Doucet, not your professional mandate. She hesitated. Her voice dropped just enough to give the impression of honesty without being overly theatrical. I respected Auguste, she said. He was difficult, yes, but driven, passionate about his craft. When he received Monsieur Brenner's recipe, he treated it like sacred text, the idea that someone would use it to injure him. It feels like blasphemy. That earned a snort from Wolfe. And yet, he said, you admit you saw nothing more than a vague silhouette and heard a bottle clink. I might point out that many bottles clink in a kitchen. Yes, she said, but most of them don't kill. That, I admit, was a good line. Even Wolfe gave her a flicker of appreciation. But appreciation isn't the same as belief, he pressed again. And your loyalty to Mr. Brillen, is it born of admiration or affection? Celeste stiffened. That is not relevant. Oh, but it is, Wolfe murmured. Everything is. Celeste left us a few minutes later, having earned Wolfe's attention, but not his endorsement. Once she'd gone, the office fell into one of those silences that feels like the air is listening too. Fritz remained standing near the bookshelves, his posture uncharacteristically stiff. I glanced at him, then at Wolfe, who was inspecting his cuticles like a man debating whether cleanliness or justice deserved his time. Finally, Fritz spoke. I did not give Auguste that recipe lightly, he said. It was one of mine, not something I copied or borrowed. I built it over years. Wolfe grunted. You've given recipes before. Not like that, it was personal. Wolfe looked up at him, really looked. For Wolfe, culinary betrayal might fall just beneath treason on the scale of offences. The notion that someone had taken Fritz's work, turned it into poison, and delivered it at the pinnacle of Manhattan's gastronomic stage wasn't just troubling, it was insulting. I broke the silence. Do you think she's sincere? Wolfe scowled. She believes what she says. That does not guarantee it is true. He turned his eyes back to Fritz. Do you wish me to investigate? Fritz didn't answer right away. He just stood there, a man who'd never asked for anything more than respect in the kitchen, and had always received it. I don't know what I wish, he said. Only that I cannot bear to think of that recipe, my recipe, remembered for murder. That did it. Wolfe leaned forward, his fingers lacing together. "Very well," he said. "Not for Miss Doucet, not even for Briand. But for you, Fritz, and for the integrity of flavour, I will look." I started jotting notes. Wolfe had said yes, which meant trouble was now marinating in our own kitchen, and I was headed straight for the fire. If there's one thing Wolfe trusts me to do better than track down the truth, it's to wear a lie convincingly. That morning, I went to La Culinaire dressed in one. My suit was dark blue with a clean pocket square, my shoes were polished, and I had a notepad I'd only ever used to doodle sausages. The business card I handed to the receptionist read, "Archibald Goodwin, freelance culinary correspondent, The Digest." I didn't specify which digest. The maitre d', a lithe man named Alain with the posture of a fencing instructor, showed me to the kitchen with only a slight curl of the lip. Journalists weren't beloved in temples of cuisine, but they were tolerated when wearing good shoes and dropping just the right names. I mentioned a review Wolfe had written of Le Coq Bleu in '47, and Alain thawed just enough to stop eyeing me like a raw escargot. The kitchen of La Culinaire wasn't chaos, it was ballet in armour. Cooks moved like soldiers in silk, and every inch of stainless steel gleamed like it had been prepped for surgery. But under the polish was a tension you could butter and slice. They were holding something in, or hiding it. I played my part, chatty, curious, a little ignorant, and wandered. I asked about signature dishes, guest chefs, how they manage supply chains in winter. They gave me answers, most of them rehearsed. But what I was really after wasn't on any printed menu. They knew I didn't belong, even if I wore the right tie. The problem with egos is they always show their edges when you lean close enough. And there, in the pastry section, sharpening his palate and polishing his sarcasm, was the man I'd come to see first, Leandro Voss. If the pastry station at La Culinaire was a kingdom, then Leandro Voss ruled it with sugar-dusted tyranny. He stood with his chest puffed, his toque tall enough to brush ambition, and a gaze that suggested he expected applause every time he piped cream. I introduced myself with the usual flattery and complimented the hazelnut millefeuille in the display. He gave me a perfunctory nod, acknowledgement from royalty, and said, "Of course. It is my invention. You may quote me." I tried him on the topic of Auguste Briand. "Chef Briand was a technician," he said, adjusting the lavender kerchief around his neck. He understood temperature and timing. He did not understand subtlety. The difference between a tart and a triumph. "And the Parfait?" I asked. "Was that his invention?" Voss gave a noise halfway between a chuckle and a snort. "Number. It was a borrowed thing, but he tried to elevate it, fussed with the layers, claimed to use an exceptional vanilla." "You tasted it?" "I smell everything in that kitchen. I smelled the almond. That much was clear." "Bitter almond?" His eyes narrowed. "There is only one kind of almond used properly in pastry. Any bitterness, monsieur, should be in chocolate, not in the finish." I logged that. I asked where he was during the final service, and he answered with theatrical disdain. Preparing the final garnish, I was called last minute to rim the coupes with spun sugar, a waste of talent but apparently necessary for visual drama. His voice was brittle, too brittle. I smiled and asked one final thing. "Do you remember who brought in the almond extract that day?" He blinked. "That is not my domain. I do not deal in inventory. I create." He was clever, but clever men often decorate their lies. Marlekine didn't bother with pleasantries. She met me in the staff hall outside the cold storage, arms folded, coat stained from morning prep, and the kind of expression that warned me to skip the compliments. "You're not a real columnist," she said flatly. "You got me," I said. I'm actually the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein. I'm just moonlighting to keep my mind sharp. She didn't smile. You're nosing into Augusta's poisoning. Guilty. She gave a weary shake of the head. They won't talk to you. They're all terrified. Some want it buried. Some are glad it happened. But no one wants to be next. I gave her a minute. Sometimes silence speaks louder than a bribe. Auguste was brilliant, she said finally, but he knew it and made sure we knew it too, always showing off, changing recipes mid-service, acting like the rest of us were amateurs. You worked directly under him? For a year, I kept his house of cards standing. You think his parfait was perfect? That was my sourcing, my timing. He had ideas. I made them edible. That sounded like motive if you were listening. Where were you when he collapsed? In the prep corridor, checking plating. Alain will vouch for me. Her tone was too smooth. I've heard better alibis from pickpockets caught mid-swipe. What about Voss? She sighed. Leandro wants to be a star. He'll put arsenic in a tart if it gets him headlines. And the almond extract? She looked away. The bottle was missing for 2 days before the banquet. Auguste said he had a new supplier. Didn't tell us who. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped away. I had just enough now to know that nobody was telling the whole truth. And Wolfe was going to want every crumb. Victor Chadney looked like a man who used to be someone and now resented everyone who still was. I found him in his cramped office above a boutique supplier's storefront on the Lower East Side. The plaque on the door still read Chadney and Sons, though I had it on good authority there hadn't been a son in the operation since the Eisenhower administration. He didn't stand when I entered, but his eyes tracked me the way a dog tracks a rival approaching its bowl. "You're not police," he said. "Sharp eye," I replied. "I'm looking into the incident at La Culinaire. Brion's collapse. Not my concern." "I've heard otherwise," I said, sitting without invitation. "Something about a disagreement over supply contracts? Ingredient sourcing?" He waved that off. Brillon wanted things nobody could get. Ethiopian vanilla, hand-foraged truffle dust, Himalayan salt, cured under moonlight. Madness. "And the almond extract?" He paused. "What about it? Was it yours?" "Number, not anymore. I stopped supplying their pastry kitchen last month." "Why?" He leaned forward. "Because they stopped paying their invoices and started acting like they were above the market. They wanted exclusive rights to ingredients I can't legally promise. When I declined, I was dismissed. Without ceremony, I might add." "And you didn't mind?" "Oh, I minded. But I'm not a murderer. I'm a businessman. I sell flavors, not funerals." He said it well, but not convincingly. His resentment oozed from his sleeves. "Still," I said, "if you were inclined to ruin someone's recipe, you'd know how." He gave me a tight smile. "Let's just say, some recipes deserve to be ruined." I left before the bitterness in the room curdled the air. Wolfe would want him on the list, I just wasn't sure which list. I went back to La Culinaire under the pretense of needing follow-up notes for my feature on kitchen elegance, which got me a tight smile from Alain and a 3-minute pass to Rome before someone slapped a spoon out of my hand. In the prep station, I spotted it, a knife, gleaming clean in a bin of soaking ladles. Not strange, until I noticed it was the only carbon steel blade in a kitchen that prided itself on stainless. Curious. A dishwasher named Felix, barely old enough to shave, told me in a whisper that the knife had been rushed back just after Brillon collapsed. No one had used it since. The chef who favoured that knife, fired last week, no notice, no replacement, just gone. "Why?" I asked. Felix shrugged. He yelled at Auguste, called him a thief. I noted that. Back near the waste bins, I got lucky again. Wedged behind a stack of unused crates was a small brown bottle with an almond-shaped label, mostly torn off. I picked it up with a napkin and sniffed. Even a rookie could smell it. Bitter almond, sharp as a lie and twice as risky. A near cousin to cyanide. No one seemed to know how it had gotten there. And nobody wanted to. I tucked the bottle into my coat pocket like a man carrying a loaded gun made of vanilla. By the time I left, I had 3 things Wolfe would call indications of interest. A missing chef with a motive, a mysteriously cleaned knife, and a bottle that shouldn't have been anywhere near dessert. I also had a feeling. This wasn't sabotage by incompetence. This was artful. Somebody had practiced. I got back to the brownstone and filled Wolfe in while he leaned in his chair, eyes shut, fingers tented like a man trying to solve theology without divine aid. When I got to the part about the fired chef, he opened one eye. And no forwarding address? None that I could get without turning over a few rocks. He grunted. Fritz had retired to the kitchen, silent since I began. When I mentioned the almond bottle, he turned, mouth pinched. I didn't push him. Wolfe looked toward the corner of the office, where the phone waited. Call Saul. That was all. If I were less secure in my abilities, I might have resented it. But Saul Panzer is Wolfe's scalpel. Quiet, efficient, precise. He's the man you call when you don't need muscle but can't afford mistakes. I reached him, and he came over within the hour, wearing his usual blend of unmemorable clothes and razor-edged awareness. Wolfe gave him 2 assignments. 1, he said, trace the procurement chain for Ethiopian vanilla. I want to know where Auguste Brillant acquired it and whether it passed through Chadney's hands, directly or otherwise. 2, he continued, Miss Celeste Doucet. Discreet surveillance. I want her habits, associates, and any communications with Chadney or anyone else who profits from culinary corruption. Saul nodded once, jotted nothing down, and left without further ceremony. He was already on the case before the front door closed. I turned to Wolfe. You think she's in on it? I think she's more than ornamental, Wolfe replied. That makes her dangerous, or valuable. And with Saul watching her, we'd know which soon enough. Wolfe didn't say much the rest of the day. That's often the case when the game is afoot, but the board is still covered with shadows. He dined early, roast squab and asparagus tips, prepared with quiet precision by Fritz, who still hadn't recovered his full vocabulary. When the table was cleared and the coffee poured, I gave Wolfe my final notes, timeline fragments, inconsistencies, and half hints from everyone I'd met. When I finished, he didn't look up. He just reached for a peach and began peeling it with the gravity of a surgeon prepping for brain work. Everyone, he said slowly, had a reason to dislike Briand. Sure, I replied, but most people who dislike someone don't lace their desserts with cyanide. Usually, they just post bad reviews. He didn't smile. Dislike isn't motive. Disgrace is. Displacement. Lost position. Lost power. Chadney? He lost contracts, yes. And face. Marla? Dismissed. Overworked. Never credited. That breeds quiet fury. Voss? Ego and envy, a volatile pairing. He sipped his coffee. The one thing missing is access. Who had the opportunity? The almond extract, the plating, the precise control of timing. The answer is in the sequence of preparation. I nodded. And the missing chef? Curious, Wolfe admitted, but too convenient. I suspect a red herring or a scapegoat. I leaned back. So what's next? We wait, he said, for Saul, for the threads to pull themselves taut. Wolfe hates waiting, but he does it better than anyone I know. He waits like a trap waits. And when the bait is a poisoned parfait, someone's bound to take another bite. It was 8:43 a.m. when the call came through. Too early for murder, too late for excuses. I was on my second cup of coffee when the phone rang, and when I heard the voice on the other end, I knew the temperature in the brownstone was about to drop a few degrees. It was Lieutenant Rowcliffe. He's about as pleasant as a burnt omelette, but this time his tone was more subdued than smug. "Thought you'd like to know," he said. "Your friend from La Culinaire, the pastry man, Leandro Voss, dead." That earned a pause. "Cause?" I asked. He hesitated. "Same M.O. as Briand. Collapsed alone in his apartment. Lab work's not final, but we're already betting on cyanide." I thanked him, hung up, and went to Wolfe, who was elbow-deep in orchid leaves and muttering Latin to a Vanda hybrid. He didn't turn around when I entered, but his shoulders stiffened the moment I said Voss's name. "Dead?" "Very. Same symptoms. Collapsed in his kitchen, no witnesses." "Foy." That was all at first. He went back to pruning, but with the kind of precise irritation that told me his mind was already halfway through the autopsy. By the time we sat in the office 30 minutes later, the implications had bloomed like the orchids, silent, elaborate, and poisonous. We now had 2 victims, same culinary circle, same symptoms, and more importantly, the same dish. Wolfe didn't pace, he never does. But if thought made sound, the office would have roared. A man like Voss didn't just drop, he was dropped, with care. Which meant whoever had started this wasn't finished. By mid-afternoon, we had a preliminary report from the city coroner. Cyanide again, this time traced not through pills or inhalants, but through ingestion. The compound, amygdalin, just like Briand. Traces of bitter almond oil found in Voss's esophagus, identical to the composition found in the first case. I relayed the details to Wolfe as he swirled a snifter of Madeira and made a low, growling noise that, in another species, might have signaled hunger. In his case, it signaled contempt for whoever thought they could pull off a second poisoning under his very nose. "Too convenient?" he murmured. "The method?" I asked. "No," he said. "The pattern. Repetition is rarely a flaw in the planning of murder. It's a message or a mistake." I tossed out a few theories: revenge, misdirection, panic. He waved them away like flies. "The almond was not accidental," he said. "It was a signature. The question is not who introduced it. We know that circle is finite. The question is why repeat it when the first attempt had not yet resolved?" I knew the answer, though I didn't like it. "To ensure the message isn't lost." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "It is a second blow, not to kill, but to confirm." I glanced over at Fritz, who had come in quietly and stood holding a tray that none of us had noticed. His eyes were rimmed in sleeplessness. "They've corrupted the dessert," he said, almost to himself. "First Brillen, now Voss." Wolfe looked up. "They've corrupted your dessert, Fritz?" Fritz nodded and left without a word. 2 men dead, one from Fritz's recipe, the second from the echo of it. And the bitter aftertaste, it seemed, was only just beginning. It wasn't until Saul returned with a manila folder and that infuriating calm of his that the final piece of the current puzzle dropped into place, and when it did, it came with the quiet weight of certainty. Wolfe accepted the folder with a nod, opened it, and read in silence. Saul stood by the bookshelves, glancing nowhere in particular. I waited. The room was tense with something just on the cusp of being spoken. "Ethiopian vanilla," Wolfe said at last. "Imported through a specialty broker," Saul replied. "Only 5 registered accounts in New York City. 2 of them belong to La Culinaire, 1 to a private chocolatier in Brooklyn, 1 to an anonymous shell company." "And the 5th?" Wolfe asked. "Auguste Brillant. His account was established 6 months ago, paid in cash. Delivery accepted at a private address in Soho." I leaned forward. "So he wasn't using the restaurant's supply?" No, Saul said. He went around them. Wolfe grunted. That confirms it. The Parfait served the night of Brion's poisoning. Was made with Fritz's original specifications, I finished. Fritz, sitting quietly near the office door, looked up. I only ever gave that to Auguste, years ago. On paper, Wolfe echoed. Which can be intercepted, copied, or stolen. Saul stepped forward. I also tracked a series of letters. One was sent by Fritz to Auguste last fall, mentioned a refinement using Ethiopian vanilla pods. That letter never arrived. Intercepted? I asked. Possibly, or misdirected deliberately. Auguste never acknowledged it. Wolfe closed his eyes. Then someone else read it and used it. I felt the knot tighten. Someone had taken Fritz's private communication, replicated the recipe to the letter, and used it to poison not once, but twice. Brion first to send a message, Voss second to bury the lead. We were no longer dealing with mere culinary sabotage. This was something colder, calculated. Someone had weaponized a dessert recipe, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And Wolfe, now fully alert, was ready to begin the counterattack. One thing I've learned from sitting in Wolfe's orbit long enough to calculate its gravitational pull is that most crimes leave a paper trail, not always legal documents or banking records, but the slow, inked drift of correspondence. When people think no one's watching, they tend to say just a little too much with a stamp. So when Wolfe suggested the recipe sabotage might have begun with a letter, Fritz's letter, I made it my business to chase envelopes. Fritz, to his credit, kept neat records. He had carbon copies of everything he'd mailed Auguste over the last 3 years, filed in order and labelled with an efficiency that made even me look organized. I borrowed the stack and sat down with a pot of coffee and a bad mood. The last letter that Auguste had replied to was dated 6 months ago, a thank you note in tight script, praising a variation Fritz had suggested for caramel layering. But after that, silence. Which was odd, considering Fritz had sent 2 more letters after that date. One in December, discussing rare Tahitian vanilla substitutes, and one in late January, specifically mentioning Ethiopian vanilla pods and their precise use in cold layering. Auguste never wrote back, I asked Fritz. He shook his head. Number I thought he was simply busy. He'd mentioned an overseas trip. Did he ever acknowledge receiving them? No. I went through the envelopes again. Same address, same signature, all sent from the same post office. Wolfe listened in silence, then muttered, intercepted, or diverted. By whom? I asked. The same person who used the knowledge inside to poison 2 men. That was the rub. Someone had read those letters, stolen the recipe, and timed its use with surgical precision. And letters, once stolen, rarely walk off by themselves. Saul Panzer doesn't knock twice. When he entered the office late that afternoon, his face had that bland neutrality that always precedes a storm. Wolfe looked up from his chair, closed the book he wasn't really reading, and motioned him forward. I followed Miss Doucet, Saul said, for 3 days, mostly routine. Home to work, work to home, groceries, a coffee shop. Then today, around 11, she took a cab, not the subway, to a side alley behind an industrial block on Varick Street. I followed on foot. He opened his satchel and placed a small envelope on Wolfe's desk. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear. Wolfe picked up the first and held it at arm's length. Victor Chadney, he said. Standing too close to Celeste, leaning toward her with a look that wasn't quite businesslike. In the second photo, she was holding a small package, brown, folded at the top. In the third, her eyes were scanning the alley, checking for watchers. She stayed 10 minutes, Saul continued. They didn't argue. No signs of distress. She handed him something, he handed her something else. Then they parted without touching. "What do you make of it?" Wolfe asked. "I don't guess," Saul said. Wolfe nodded. I leaned over Saul's shoulder and studied the images again. "She's the one who brought us the case," I said. "Why hand off ingredients to Chadney behind a warehouse?" "Insurance," Wolfe murmured. "Or collusion." Saul added, "Chadney's accounts show a recent wire from a Cayman Shell corporation, 1 week before Brion's poisoning." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "She came to us to direct the investigation, to shape it." "And steer us away from herself?" I asked. "No," Wolfe said, "to steer us toward a solution that doesn't include her name." And just like that, the kitchen got hotter. Saul came back the next morning with more than photographs. He brought handwriting samples, procurement copies, and the kind of quiet certainty that makes you sit up straighter before he even opens his mouth. "I got into Brion's kitchen records," he said. "It wasn't difficult. They've got everything logged by hand, ingredient deliveries, substitutions, dates, and sources." Wolfe raised a brow. "Primitive." "Convenient," Saul replied. "Easier to tamper with than digital logs, which is exactly what someone did." He passed Wolfe a sheet of crisp white paper, a scan of a page from Brion's final prep log. The handwriting in the middle row wavered oddly, its slope inconsistent with the rest. "Note the supplier listed for the vanilla pods," Saul said. "Chadney's business name is there. But in 2 previous logs, same dish, same ingredients, it's not." "Let me guess," I said. "The original supplier was Brion's private contact. The Soho delivery." Saul nodded. "Correct." I compared the samples. This entry was added after the fact, probably after Brion's collapse. "Clever," Wolfe murmured. "Not quite," Saul said. "They forgot to change the ink. Different pen, slightly darker, a hasty patch job." Wolfe closed his eyes, which is always the cue for silence. He didn't need interruptions. He needed to listen to the pieces rearranging themselves in the quiet caverns of his mind. I shuffled through the pages and frowned. So, whoever added Chadney's name wanted it to look like Brion had sourced the vanilla through official channels, through a known distributor. "To cast suspicion away from the personal recipe," Wolfe said softly, "and away from whomever intercepted Fritz's letter." "That brings us back to the missing correspondence," I said. "The one with the detail about the Ethiopian vanilla." "Indeed," Wolfe said. We now had motive, method, and manipulation, all executed within the walls of a kitchen supposedly devoted to precision and purity. Someone was rewriting the story, line by line, in cursive and poison. And Wolfe was starting to see where the edits ended and where the real author hid. When Nero Wolfe retreats, it isn't with fanfare. There's no announcement, no speech, no ceremonial closing of doors. He simply disappears, mentally at first, then physically. That afternoon, following Saul's revelations, he rose from his desk like a man already deep underwater and vanished into the orchid room with the grace of a glacier shifting course. I knew better than to follow. Fritz, too, kept a wide berth. The brownstone turned quiet in the way only that house can, rich with anticipation, held in suspension. Wolfe's method of thought was part ritual, part machinery. When presented with misdirection, he went still, not to escape it, but to let it surface. And with every minute he spent among the orchids, his inner ledger rearranged itself. I didn't waste the time. I ran a few quiet checks, backtracked Marla Keene's references, confirmed the employment record of the vanished prep chef, pulled receipts from a specialty spice importer in Newark, whose records put Chadney's name on a shipment of vanilla extract dated 2 months before Brion's collapse. They'd been signed for in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, I smelled forgery. By the time evening cast its long shadows through the office, Wolfe returned. He didn't sit. He stood behind his desk, fingers resting on the back of his chair. That meant something, usually something dangerous. "I have been uncommonly indulgent," he said, "in permitting the pretense of ambiguity to continue this long." "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said. "Celeste Doucet brought us this case not because she wished it solved, but because she wished to shape its resolution." I nodded. "And the photos confirm she had dealings with Chadney." "They shared a purpose, but not a loyalty. Chadney is a blunt instrument, resentful, greedy. Celeste is something else entirely, precise, calculating. She knew the dessert would point suspicion back to Brillon's own hands because she ensured it did." "And Voss?" I asked. "Collateral," Wolfe replied. He discovered the truth, perhaps in the altered logs, perhaps in the kitchen. Either way, he became a liability. "And the altered letter?" "Intercepted, certainly. Likely copied, possibly by Celeste herself." I exhaled. "So what now?" "Now," Wolfe said, "we set the table." And if I knew Wolfe, the dish he intended to serve next would be cold, intricate, and fatal only to the guilty. Wolfe didn't say trap. He never does. But when he asked me to draft invitations on our engraved stationery and dictated the wording himself, well, I didn't need it spelled out. The cards were elegant, terse, and written with enough formality to dress the occasion as a culinary tribute to the late Auguste Brion and the even later Leandro Voss. Wolfe requested their valued colleagues and associates to join him for a private supper at the Brownstone, a modest gathering in honor of their contributions to the art of flavor. That's Wolfe speak, for I'm calling you in, and don't pretend you're busy. I delivered the invitations personally because Wolfe wanted to observe their reactions. I carried a fountain pen and a smile I'd borrowed from a society columnist. Celeste received hers in the lounge at L'Art Culinaire. She read it slowly, her mouth curving just enough to suggest approval. Chadney got his in his warehouse office and looked like he'd swallowed a pitted olive. Marla Keene raised an eyebrow and said only, "Of course." Alain the maitre d' seemed flattered. I didn't bother with Saul, he was already in. Each invitation was timed to make refusal difficult without looking guilty, and the phrasing made it clear the evening was social, not investigative. When I returned, Wolfe asked only one question. "Did anyone appear surprised?" "No," I said. But Chadney flinched. Wolfe nodded once. "This," he said, "is the final course. I intend to see who chokes. The Brownstone doesn't host many dinners for the uninvited, and it's even rarer that the dining room is used for anyone but Wolfe, Fritz, and yours truly." But that evening, the table was dressed in quiet menace, fine linen, polished silver, and seating assignments arranged with more calculation than a diplomatic summit. Wolfe, of course, didn't rise to greet anyone. He remained in his chair at the head of the table, half-lidded and massive, a presence rather than a participant. I played host, seating the guests with an eye toward discomfort. Marla Keene to Wolfe's left, Celeste Doucet to his right, and Victor Chadney across from Fritz, who'd been conscripted into serving rather than eating. There were 6 of us in total. Wolfe had declined to invite anyone from the NYPD, stating dryly that their appetites lacked subtlety. Dinner began with smoked duck and endive, then progressed to a delicate consommé that Fritz had made from scratch, though his eyes rarely left Celeste's plate. Conversation was stilted at best. Everyone knew something was coming, even if they couldn't guess the shape of it. Wolfe spoke little, but when he did, it was to probe. He asked Marla about seasonal variations in hazelnut flavor, drawing her into a long, spiraling explanation that seemed harmless until she realized she'd just confessed to sourcing a batch of extract personally, unrecorded. He asked Celeste about staff loyalty at La Culinaire, and she replied with the grace of a diplomat, but her hand trembled once when she reached for her wine. Chadney mostly pushed his food around and tried to look unimpressed. He failed. I watched them closely, noting how each one interacted with the setting, the conversation, the proximity to one another. They weren't guests. They were suspects with linen napkins. And Wolfe hadn't even started yet. It arrived with the quiet fanfare Fritz reserved for occasions that meant something. A line of crystal Parfait coupes, each layered in perfect symmetry, raspberry, vanilla, chocolate, and a wafer-thin curl of candied citrus resting on top. Nothing unusual, except that this was the dessert that had poisoned one man and damned another. Wolfe waited until the dishes had been served and Fritz had retreated. Then he leaned forward, resting both hands on the table like a judge about to announce sentence. "This," he said, "is the original version of the dessert you all know, created by Fritz Brenner, adapted by Auguste Briand, and—" He paused, subsequently misused. The silence was long and deliberate. Then he gestured toward the parfaits. "Eat if you wish." Marla hesitated, then lifted her spoon. Celeste did the same, slower. Chadney didn't move. I didn't eat. Wolfe rarely eats dessert during investigations. He finds sugar blunts his focus. I focused instead on them. Marla took 2 bites, then set her spoon down, as if the flavor had shifted. Celeste didn't eat. She stirred the top layer, watching the spoon trail through the cream like she was drawing maps. Chadney finally spoke. "I assume this is some kind of test?" Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he addressed Fritz, who had returned quietly. "Fritz, did you follow the exact proportions as you recorded in the letter to Brillant last January?" Fritz nodded. "Yes, down to the pod." Wolfe looked at the table, which means the only people who could recognize this specific variation, the Ethiopian vanilla layered after freezing, are those who read that letter. Chadney's head jerked slightly. Celeste looked up at Wolfe, expression unreadable. Wolfe smiled, a tight, thin-lipped thing that carried no warmth. "I am no chef," he said, "but even I can taste the truth when it is served in proper proportion." And with that, he gestured for coffee, signaling in his way that the real meal was about to begin. Once the parfaits had been tasted, though not eaten, the mood shifted. Not dramatically, but like a curtain being drawn a few inches more. Wolfe had set the table. Now he intended to season the conversation with something subtle, suspicion. He reached for his demitasse, sipped once, and spoke with offhand ease. "I have long maintained that vanilla is the most underestimated of flavors. Its subtleties are often lost on the casual palate, particularly when the source is unknown." He let that hang for a moment before continuing. "Of course, not all vanilla is created equal. Tahitian is floral, almost perfumed. Madagascar has depth, but lacks sharpness. But Ethiopian vanilla, that is another matter. It cuts." Celeste glanced up. Marla stiffened, then reached for her water. But it was Chadney who gave the most satisfying response. His jaw tightened as though Wolfe had just named his price. Wolfe continued. "It is difficult to acquire naturally, nearly impossible, unless one has direct access to certain private suppliers." Marla found her voice first. "We never used it at La Culinaire. Too costly. Auguste was curious about it, but we didn't have a source." Wolfe didn't look at her. Curious, yes, he had reason to be. A refinement suggested to him in confidence. In a letter, as it happens, from Mr. Brenner. Chadney let his spoon clatter into his dish. "That's ridiculous." Wolfe turned. "Is it? I never saw such a letter." No one said you had, Wolfe replied smoothly. Chadney's face reddened, but he said nothing. I glanced around the table. Celeste's hands were clasped in her lap, unmoving. Marla was biting the inside of her cheek. Wolfe set his cup down gently. "Of course," he said. "It takes a refined tongue to detect the Ethiopian strain. Only those who've worked with it could distinguish it in a finished dish. He didn't need to add, and you just did." Wolfe waited a beat, just long enough for the tension to settle into everyone's spine, then turned casually to Chadney. "You seem unsettled, Mr. Chadney. Is the dessert unappealing?" Chadney wiped his brow. It's fine." Wolfe's gaze narrowed. "You objected quite strongly to the mention of a letter. Why?" Chadney leaned forward. "Because it's a distraction. You're spinning this into something it isn't. I had no reason to hurt August. He dropped my contract months ago." "Ah," Wolfe said, resentment but no motive. "I wouldn't kill him over a contract." "No," Wolfe said softly, "but you might forge a supplier record to implicate someone else." That hit. Chadney opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes darted to Celeste, who remained stone-faced, and then to his half-empty wine glass. I could almost see the sweat bead behind his ears. "I never touched his logs," Chadney muttered. "I never even saw them." "No one said you had," Wolfe repeated, voice even and quiet. That was Wolfe's second strike, and Chadney knew it. His face twitched, barely, but enough. Celeste shifted slightly. Not visibly enough for most to notice, but Wolfe did. His gaze flicked toward her, then returned to Chadney, like a lens snapping back into focus. "The problem with lies," Wolfe murmured, "is not that they're false, it's that they're clumsy, a forged ingredient list, a staged meeting in an alley, a photograph that tells more than it hides." Chadney sat back, hard in his chair. "You're twisting things." "Am I?" Wolfe turned to me then. "Archie, perhaps we should discuss dessert again." I nodded, catching his tone. He wanted a shift, a jolt to let Chadney breathe, think he'd been spared. I turned to Fritz and asked him about the sugar rim technique. Chadney exhaled audibly. A rookie move. He thought the worst was over, but Wolfe wasn't finished. He was only letting the lie cool. Wolfe gave no grand gesture, no theatrical cue, just a flick of his index finger toward the credenza. It was enough. Saul Panzer rose from his chair with the same quiet inevitability as a rising tide. He'd been seated at the end of the table, mostly silent during the meal, though no less present. He might have passed for a polite guest, if you didn't know him. He opened a slim folder and stepped forward, placing a single sheet in front of Wolfe before turning to address the table. When Saul speaks in that tone, measured, precise, you listen. "This is a copy of a letter," he said, "purportedly written by Fritz Brenner to Auguste Briand. It contains specific details regarding the use of Ethiopian vanilla in the final construction of a layered parfait. It matches, word for word, a page found in Briand's personal kitchen notebook, retrieved after his collapse." Wolfe adjusted his glasses and regarded the letter with mild distaste, like a man offered an overcooked steak. "Unfortunately," Saul continued, "this letter is a forgery." Now he had their attention. Chadney sat motionless, hands beneath the table. "I examined 3 of Fritz's original letters," Saul went on, "and compared the typeface, indentation spacing, and phrasing. The letter found with Briand's effects was typed on a machine Fritz hasn't owned in 5 years. More notably, a microscopic fiber embedded in the page's fold is from a courier envelope, one matching a series used exclusively by Victor Chadney's business accounts." Celeste inhaled sharply. Chadney said nothing. "The letter never reached Briand," Wolfe said. "It was intercepted, copied, then inserted into Briand's notebook post-poisoning to suggest the origin of the recipe had been his. And to misdirect any scrutiny toward Fritz. Still, Chadney remained silent, but his face had hardened, not in defiance, but in calculation. Wolfe turned to him. It was a clever edit, but even clever edits leave fingerprints. Chadney opened his mouth, then shut it. I didn't need to look at Saul. I knew we had him. Wolfe stood, an event rare enough to command silence on its own. His size didn't diminish the room, it consumed it, and when he speaks standing, it's never idle. He placed both palms on the table and looked at each guest in turn. "Victor Chadney," he said evenly, "you poisoned Auguste Briand, not with malice, but with method. You forged a letter to imply the poison Parfait originated from Fritz Brenner's recipe, a calculated effort to both discredit and humiliate a man whose reputation blocked your re-entry into the elite culinary market." Chadney's lips parted. Wolfe cut him off with a glance. "You resented Briand for replacing you as supplier. You resented the restaurant for dismissing you. But most of all, you resented being forgotten. So you chose a signature dish, one linked to Fritz, to Briand, to a perfection you could never claim. You modified it just enough to be fatal." No one breathed. Wolfe continued, his voice growing colder. "Leandro Voss discovered the truth. Whether through his palate or the altered kitchen logs, he realized what had been done. You silenced him. Using the same method, that was your mistake." He held up the parfait spoon resting by his place. "This dessert contains no poison, but it contains something rarer, precision. The Ethiopian vanilla layer, as described in a letter never delivered, known only to Fritz and Auguste, until you intercepted it." Chadney slumped slightly in his seat. "You stole a flavor, then you used it to commit murder." Celeste, across the table, finally spoke. Her voice was faint. "I didn't know about Voss." Wolfe looked at her. "You suspected, but you lacked the nerve to act, or the innocence to object." Then he sat, and with that single motion the tension in the room cracked, not with a bang, but a quiet resignation. Wolfe did not announce the conclusion. He didn't need to. The silence spoke for him, one so complete you could hear the settling of flatware on linen. Chadney didn't protest. He didn't confess either. But the color had left his face, and his eyes no longer darted. They stared downward into the folds of his napkin as if they might contain a plea. Wolfe gestured faintly toward the door. "Mr. Panzer will accompany you to the police." That was it. Chadney rose slowly, like a man waking from a bad dream he hadn't earned the right to escape. Saul followed him out, silent as ever. Celeste stood. "I'll leave too." "You should," Wolfe said. She looked at Fritz but found no comfort there. He was still, arms folded, as unreadable as the ledgers she'd helped obscure. She left. Marla and Alain, still in their seats, exchanged a glance. Then Wolfe turned to them. "I trust you can explain your knowledge of the forged logs to the appropriate authorities. I'll provide them a transcript." Neither of them answered, but they left, swiftly. And then the room was quiet again, just the three of us, Wolfe, Fritz, and me, surrounded by the ghosts of a meal that had served justice with its final spoonful. Wolfe sighed and pushed his plate forward. "Fritz," he said gently. "The parfait was excellent." Fritz bowed slightly. "Thank you." He disappeared toward the kitchen. I looked at Wolfe. "Case closed?" He gave a small shrug. "Nothing is ever truly closed, but this course is finished." I stood, stretched, and grinned. "Well, I've had worse dinners." Wolfe didn't look up. "I haven't," he said, and I believed him. There are few places in New York more uncomfortable than Nero Wolfe's office when he's decided you have something to hide. It's not the furniture, Fritz keeps it spotless, or the temperature. Wolfe insists on a constant 72. It's the air. It thickens like molasses waiting for a match. On this particular afternoon, the office was arranged with surgical precision. Celeste Doucet was seated nearest Wolfe's desk, legs crossed and posture perfect. Marla Keene hovered by the window, arms folded as though distance might deflect suspicion. Alain, the ever-neutral maître d', had claimed the far end of the red settee and was pretending he didn't resent being summoned like a schoolboy. Chadney, freshly escorted back by Saul Panzer, stood with the kind of slouch that announces defeat before the verdict. I took my usual place, notebook in hand. Not that Wolfe needed a transcript for memory, but he liked things preserved in writing. Wolfe didn't bother to rise. He sat behind his desk, enormous and motionless, his fingertips pressed together like a man preparing to conduct a symphony of guilt. "I have summoned you," he said without preamble, "not for confession but for correction. There are errors in the narrative you have each attempted to construct. I dislike errors." Celeste opened her mouth. Wolfe raised a finger. "I will speak. You will listen. There will be no interruptions. Mr. Goodwin is armed with ink." She closed her mouth. Wolfe's gaze moved from one face to the next, pausing not long, but long enough to leave an imprint. "The truth," he said, "is a dish best served without garnish. Let us proceed." And with that the office became a courtroom, with no judge but logic, and no exit but truth. "There are 2 deaths," Wolfe began, "and one attempted framing. Auguste Briand, poisoned mid-service. Leandro Voss, silenced shortly after, both by cyanide, both through the same dessert. This much we accept." He paused. The poison's vector was the almond extract, bitter, traceable, deceptively mundane. A kitchen staple turned into a murder weapon. Marla shifted. Wolfe didn't look at her but noted it all the same. Fritz Brenner's original recipe, gifted years ago, was private, shared only with Briand, but the version used at La Culinaire on the night of Briand's collapse included a recent refinement, Ethiopian vanilla, a note Fritz mentioned only once. He turned to Fritz. "In a letter sent earlier this year." Fritz nodded once. "That letter," Wolfe continued, "never arrived. Or rather, it never arrived at its intended destination. But it was received, intercepted, duplicated, weaponized." I saw Celeste's knuckles whiten on her silk gloves. The recipe's presence in Briand's private log, handwritten and supposedly received by him, was meant to implicate him in his own demise. A tragic accident from a misguided improvisation. But the log was altered after his collapse. He lifted a page from the dossier in front of him and passed it to Alain. "Note the discrepancy in ink and indentation." Alain paled. Wolfe's voice remained level, unhurried. "To orchestrate this, one would need access to Briand's records. Motive. And knowledge of Fritz's correspondence." He turned to Chadney. "You were dismissed by the restaurant, replaced, forgotten. You forged the letter, you supplied the extract, you positioned the recipe where it would do the most damage, and take down not only Briand, but Fritz by association." Chadney said nothing. Wolfe looked at him with the same contempt he reserved for canned consommé. "You used cuisine to commit murder. That is both unforgivable and, worse, inelegant." Wolfe let the accusation hang, like the scent of something scorched in a pristine kitchen. Then he reached for a second page, thin, crisp, and faintly yellowed. He held it between 2 fingers, careful not to crease it. "This," he said, "is a carbon copy of the original letter Fritz sent to Briand, dated January 6th. It describes, in Fritz's own language, the Ethiopian vanilla refinement." He passed it to Celeste, who took it as though it might explode. Compare that to the letter discovered in Briand's kitchen notebook. Same content, yes, but different typeface, different margins, different tone, an imitation hastily crafted. Fritz cleared his throat. That letter was mailed from the 12th Street post office. Wolfe nodded. And never delivered. It was intercepted. He turned back to the room. I posit this. Victor Chadney, angered by his dismissal, sought a way to exact revenge without raising a finger. He intercepted the letter, likely, with Celeste Doucet's assistance. They had the access, the motive, the opportunity. Celeste stood. No. Sit, Wolfe snapped. You brought this case to me not from conscience but calculation. You feared Chadney's recklessness. You sought to shape the narrative before it shaped you. She sat. Wolfe turned to Saul, who produced the envelope Chadney had mishandled earlier that week, still bearing his company's watermark. Saul retrieved this from Chadney's office, Wolfe said. It matches the fibre embedded in the folded forgery. Chadney printed it. Celeste ensured it found its way into Brilon's notebook. Chadney spoke, finally. I didn't kill Voss. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Number U poisoned him. You merely failed to predict that he would read between the lines. He recognized the tampering. Perhaps he said something. Perhaps he didn't. But you couldn't risk it. Chadney slumped. Wolfe's voice dropped, cool and final. You forged a letter, manipulated a dish, and built a crime from flavor. He folded his hands. I trust the district attorney has better taste. Wolfe let the weight of Chadney's guilt sink into the room like a dense, flourless cake. But his eyes, now slightly narrowed, drifted to the other side of the table. Miss Keene, he said, as gently as one might address a scorpion, you've been curiously mute. Marla, who had been performing the classic act of self-disappearance, arms crossed, gaze fixed somewhere 2 inches past the nearest curtain, looked up, startled. Not frightened, just cornered. Wolfe went on. As sous chef, you had knowledge of every ingredient that entered that kitchen. You were responsible for logs, substitutions, and oversight. She didn't respond. Yet you saw nothing, said nothing, and allowed a forged log entry to stand. Still nothing. Wolfe tapped the arm of his chair. You suspected, at minimum, that the ingredient log had been altered. You had reason to question Chadney's continued proximity to the staff, and yet no word to Brilon, no word to management. Finally, she spoke. It wasn't my place. Foy, Wolfe snapped. Your place was precisely there, watching, thinking, choosing, and you chose to say nothing, not from guilt, but fear. Her voice cracked, just slightly. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would end with Brion. I didn't think. You didn't want to think, Wolfe said, soft now. Because thinking leads to choice, and choice demands courage. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Wolfe turned away from her, the judgment rendered not in outrage, but in dismissal. And that stung worse than any accusation. Victor Chadney's mask had cracked hours ago. What remained now was a man not caught in a trap, but methodically herded into it, step by mental step. The only thing left was to watch it close. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, not relaxed, not triumphant, but resolute. You intercepted a private letter, he said, his tone cool. You forged a version that matched Fritz Brenner's voice closely enough to avoid suspicion by casual eyes. You planted that letter among Brilon's effects after poisoning him to misdirect blame. Chadney stared at the floor. You manipulated the kitchen log, Wolfe went on, so the vanilla would appear to have come from your legitimate channels. You made sure the tampered extract remained hidden until it was too late. Chadney raised his head. I didn't mean for Voss to die. Wolfe's brow lifted a millimeter. Ah, conscience at last, or perhaps just regret. He was nosing around, Chadney muttered. Asking about supply records, I didn't have a choice. Of course you did, Wolfe said. You had 1,000 opportunities, but you chose the one that left 2 men dead and a third nearly disgraced. Chadney's jaw clenched. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Augustus stole from me, blacklisted me from the industry. That recipe was the last straw. He made it his own. He refined it, Wolfe said, as is the tradition of all great chefs, but he credited it to Fritz. You, however, sought to destroy it. Chadney slumped in the chair. Fine, I did it. I wanted them to suffer, and I wanted it traced to him. He jerked his chin toward Fritz, so everyone would see how the high and mighty fall. I didn't speak. Wolfe didn't gloat. We just let the confession rest in the air, ripe, heavy, final. Then Wolfe gestured toward me. Mr. Goodwin will see that your words are preserved. And I did. There are a few things I've come to appreciate in this line of work: a good fedora, an honest lie, and the soft scratch of a fountain pen across cream paper when justice is being inked into permanence. As Wolfe leaned back into silence and Saul prepared to escort Chadney into his new career as a cautionary tale, I set my notes in order. My handwriting, as always, was sharp and clean. Wolfe insists on legibility, and I don't mind the discipline. I had recorded every word of Chadney's unravelling, not because I doubted the law's ability to prosecute without it, though Lord knows Wolfe does, but because Wolfe's brand of justice never relied on jury theatrics. His victory was never the gavel, it was the clarity. The transcript mattered, it always did. Celeste had slunk back into the chair, smaller now. The elegance had wilted, the poise turned brittle. She wouldn't face jail time. Wolfe hadn't pinned her to the crimes, but she wouldn't walk away clean either. Her silence had purchase, and she'd spent it. Marla was quiet, as she had been all evening. When she stood to leave, Wolfe neither acknowledged nor delayed her. That was mercy, Wolfe style. Indifference. Fritz remained standing in the doorway, watching the room like a man waking up in a house that had been fumigated. I caught his eye and gave a nod. It wasn't comfort exactly, just respect. Chadney, led by Saul, passed me on the way out. He didn't look at me. Maybe he didn't want to see the man who had written down his worst hour in perfect blue ink. Wolfe finally spoke. You may send a copy to Inspector Kramer. I raised an eyebrow. With or without the dessert recipe attached? He grunted. Mr. Goodwin, he said, sometimes your wit is an obstruction. Sometimes, I replied. It's all that keeps me from eating Parfait again. And with that, the office emptied of tension, inked truth neatly sealed, and Wolfe, once again, having exacted justice without standing up. 2 days later, the Brownstones' kitchen smelled the way a cathedral might if God had preferred vanilla to incense. Fritz was back in his element, not bustling, mind you. Fritz never bustles, he orchestrates, and that morning his instruments were cream, berries, and the reclaimed confidence of a man whose integrity had just been cleared of arsenic. He said nothing while he worked. He didn't need to. Every movement spoke for him, the measured beat of the whisk, the silent layering of the glassware, the way he opened the jar of Ethiopian vanilla like it was a sacred text. Wolfe, Saul, and I were summoned without fanfare. There was no grand declaration, no preamble, just Fritz, standing by the marble island with a tray of 3 parfaits, elegant, balanced, and unadorned. No sugar spiral, no garnish, just the original dessert as it was meant to be. We took our seats. Wolfe examined the parfait before lifting a spoon. I did the same, though I took a moment to appreciate the fact that this time no one at the table was at risk of collapsing. The first bite was rich, smooth, and perfectly cold. The vanilla cut through the raspberry with that precise clarity Fritz had described once as a whisper after a violin note. He didn't smile as we ate. Fritz is not the type to beam over his own work, but the silence that followed the first few spoonfuls was the kind chefs earn, not from applause, but reverence. There were no shadows in that kitchen now, no forgeries, no poisoned ambition, just the purity of craft, and this time no one stirred the top layer without finishing the dish. Wolfe doesn't compliment often. In fact, if you were to catalogue every unsolicited word of praise he's ever issued, you could probably fit them on a cocktail napkin with room for a drink ring and a toothpick. So when he finished the final spoonful, set the glass down with slow finality, and dabbed at the corners of his mouth with his napkin, I knew something was coming. Fritz, still standing, waited, not nervously, of course, but alert, like a man expecting a verdict. Wolfe folded his napkin and placed it to the side. Then he leaned back, sated but not slack, and gave a single nod. "It is correct." That was it. Fritz's eyebrows lifted, a full reaction by his standards, and he inclined his head in return. "I thank you," Wolfe added. Then after a pause, "And you may continue using the Ethiopian vanilla, sparingly." I blinked. That was the culinary equivalent of a standing ovation from Wolfe. Saul, sitting beside me, gave the faintest smile before returning to the business of scraping the bottom of his coupe. I did the same. It wasn't just dessert, it was the final line in a sonnet that had taken blood to compose. Wolfe glanced toward me, as if sensing my amusement. "You find this amusing, Mr. Goodwin?" "Not amusing," I said. "Just rare. I've seen a man go free with less ceremony than you just gave that Parfait." He grunted. "Justice requires clarity. Dessert requires restraint." I chuckled. "And compliments require a magnifying glass." Wolfe ignored that, which in his book meant I was right. By late afternoon, the brownstone had resumed its natural state, serene, structured, and faintly smelling of vanilla and authority. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, which he only does when he believes no one is listening. Saul had gone, as quietly as he'd arrived, with the original carbon letter in a folder under his arm and the assurance that the police had all they needed, without the need for Wolfe to ever set foot in a courtroom. Wolfe had retired to the orchid room, where no doubt he was inspecting a phalaenopsis bloom with the same precision he applied to criminal motive. And I was in the office with my feet on the edge of the desk, flipping through my notes and trying to decide whether the Parfait deserved a metaphor or a benediction. This case had all the flavors Wolfe likes best: intellectual sabotage, hidden ingredients, and just enough ego to curdle ambition. It had also carried the rare sting of personal insult. Someone had tried to turn Fritz's name into a garnish for a crime. And Wolfe, for all his talk of logic and principle, defends his own the way some men defend their property lines, with quiet fury and a very long memory. I thought about Celeste, how she'd brought the case to us not out of moral clarity, but out of self-preservation. About Marla, who'd watched in silence as ambition turned deadly. About Chadney, who thought he could poison a reputation and walk away clean. But most of all, I thought about the final spoonful, how it had tasted like justice, not flashy, not sweet, but right. Wolfe came back into the office just as I was finishing my notes. "Are you still writing?" he asked. "Just wrapping up." He settled into his chair and closed his eyes. "Then be brief." I closed the notebook and smiled. "All right, here it is. 1 poisoned Parfait, 2 dead chefs, a forged letter. And in the end..." I stood and tucked the notebook under my arm. The recipe's back where it belongs. And Wolfe, eyes still shut, murmured, "As it should be."